You have this idea hanging out in your cranium, a squatter in your frontal cortex, a vague concept for a game, a world inspired by a movie, a novel, a video game. But it's a slippery little mite, this brain worm. Just as you think you've pinned it down, devised some rules of play, the idea morphs. The world just grew, rendering your imagined rule set unworkable. The setting shifted to an entirely new environment. The cowboys became pirates, and your brain is off again. The cogs are turning. Before you know it, months have passed and your concept has shifted so many times you don't know what's what. You know you want this game to become a reality, that seems an impossible task. There are so many iterations filed away in your hippocampus. Which one would you produce? And these files are corrupted. Your game doesn't exist as a pure entity. Version 12 is cross-contaminated by elements of version 15, 22 and 37. How are you ever going to get this damn thing out of your head? I'm Adam Porter, I'm a game designer from Wales, and on this channel I like to share my experiences in the world of board game design. If you like what I do, please subscribe, comment and share the video. This video is really intended for those first-time designers who feel a little bit lost with the process of board game creation. I receive emails from such people on a regular basis, and the question tends to take one of two forms. 1. I want to design a board game but I don't have any ideas. Or 2, I have an incredible idea for a board game, but it's all in my head and I don't know what to do next. Now there's no right answer to either of these questions. Those first tentative steps as a game designer are perhaps the most personal, the most dependent on your own personality, tastes, experience and priorities. Fine artists don't hang their first ever painting in the Louvre, it goes on their mum's fridge. World-renowned novelists don't publish the first stories they ever penned. They're jotted in the back of an exercise book, awarded a gold star by teacher. Perhaps not even that. Game creation is the same. Your expectations for your early designs should be low, but you should enter into these experiments with a wide-eyed, childlike enthusiasm. Game ideation is a joyful process, so start out by chasing the fun. I was a game designer all my life. I just didn't realise it. I remember drawing racing cars on tiny pieces of card and flicking them across the living room floor, completing circuits around the furniture. I invented pitch car at 8 years old, some 10 years before Jean de Poel won the Spiel des Jahres with the same concept. At the age of 12, I got hooked on the Avalon Hill card game Wrastlin', a simple take-that card game simulating the Hulk Hogan era of American wrestling. But I wasn't content playing the game in the box. Mimicking the play-by-mail football leagues my older brother was obsessing over at the time, I created a wrestling league for my friends. I made a character generation system inspired by the one I'd read about in Palladium's pen and paper RPG, Heroes Unlimited. Our wrestlers upgraded their stats and signature moves. They suffered injuries, formed friendships and rivalries, switched allegiance, and evolved from one match to the next. I loved creating worlds for my friends to play in. The rules weren't balanced. Most of the time there weren't any rules. It was all off the top of my head. I was chasing the fun. Like any creative pursuit, game design shouldn't be a chore. It should never be forced. The process should be organic and easy. So what do you need to become a game designer? An active, playful spirit, and someone who will indulge you, a willing guinea pig to try out your half-baked ideas. When I was in my early 20s, my sister was 7 or 8 years old, and I loved hanging out with her and encouraging her to be creative. I was running an improv theatre group at the time. My mind was often occupied with creating new drama games in the mould of Whose Line Is It Anyway? My little sister had an enormous expanding collection of Thai Beanie Babies, animals of all varieties and colours. And together we developed a rule set for racing beanies across the living room floor, just like my cardboard racing cars, except these racers weren't flicked. Their moves were dependent on dice rolls and measured out with a tape. They could attack and defend too, and each racer had its own traits depending on its species. So horses had a boost for speed, dogs had an attack bonus when fighting cats, winged animals ignored difficult terrain, and each animal would level up depending on the outcome of a race. Their stats would change and they'd develop new skills, all recorded in a little notebook. This was Warhammer meets D&D meets plushies. And we played for hours. I still didn't know that I was a game designer. These are the scrawls of a nascent illustrator, the scribblings of an emerging author. Game design is no different to any other art form. When you start out, you do it for the love of it. But crucially, I did do it. My ideas didn't linger in my head. I put pen to paper quickly. I wasn't embarrassed or fearful. I designed terrible games, but I fixed them as we played. I had no concept of an end result. I only cared about having fun. If you ever meet me in person at a game design meetup, you'll probably find me quiet and polite, perhaps a little aloof, smug even, and occasionally brash. New designers often try to tell me their ideas and I tend to give them short shrift. I'm not intentionally rude, my mind just doesn't work that way. Get those ideas on the table in whatever form they spill out of your muddled mind. Be fearless and unashamed. No one can play the game in your head. Put physical components in front of us and let's take this thing for a spin. Find out all the ways it's broken. And most importantly, try to locate the spark, the intangible, non-pinpointable something, the soul of the game, the fun. One of the first titles which really got me hooked on modern games was Dominion. When I started playing over a decade ago, there were a couple of expansions available, but there was a thriving community of players creating their own fan-made cards. And I quickly threw myself in too, creating wildly unbalanced kingdom cards and forcing generous friends to suffer their way through frustrating off-kilter sessions. The bulk of the fun wasn't playing, it was tinkering, laying out the cards, tweaking and adapting after each test, finding images online to blend the cards in with the original game. And it wasn't just Dominion. I recall creating my own expansions for Takenoko, Dice Town and Super Dungeon Explore. My friends must have got fed up of playing ill-conceived variants because before long I found myself creating solo modes for multiplayer games. I remember playing a lot of Glenmore and Drumroll by my own solitaire rule sets. This is a great way to learn about board game design with a very low barrier to entry. The game already works. You've got a sound system, a fully realised world. When you tweak such a game, bolt bits on or chop bits out, you start to understand the interwoven mechanisms at play and how a seemingly minor element of gameplay functions as part of a greater whole. In a well-designed game, every aspect has been carefully considered, and if it made the final cut, it's there for a reason. What happens if you lop that bit off? How is the experience altered for the players? It's a great exercise for a game creator learning their craft. What happens in Dominion if you shuffle all the cards together and reveal a market of 10 random cards instead of using predetermined decks? Why aren't purchased cards placed on top of your deck for immediate use instead of the discard pile? Well, try it and you might find out. 10 years ago, if I wasn't playing games, I was tweaking them, and I still didn't consider myself a designer. One week, on games night, a friend arrived with a prototype game he had put together. It was an area control game about fish populating a coral reef. This was the first time I'd played a game which was hugely imaginative and promising, vibrant and joyful, but also gloriously, deliciously broken. Muscle memory from 3 decades of game design, though I'd never called it that, kicked in and I became obsessed with this thing. I was the worst sort of playtester. I wanted to change everything and I bombarded my friend with praise, criticism, helpful suggestions and unwelcome alterations. After several weeks of politely incorporating elements of my feedback into the game, my designer pal gently suggested that I take all my ideas and make my own game, leaving him to develop his coral reef project in the manner that he deemed fit. I had developed a passion for design and I wanted to do more, but I had never created a new world from scratch. All of my design experience to date was based on tweaking and developing existing rule sets. In 2013, I was watching Wimbledon. Andy Murray was promising to end a 77-year wait for a Brit to claim the men's singles title. And I thought to myself, if I don't have my own rule set, why don't I just adapt an existing rule set, such as tennis, into a board game? How would that work? Well, this is my prototype for Advantage Tennis. a project I briefly shared online as a print and play game, along with 2 related games using similar mechanisms, Advantage Cricket and Advantage Baseball. Advantage Tennis is a simultaneous card selection game in which players try to deduce where their opponent is going to land the ball and then successfully return it. It's not a good game. But this was the first time I genuinely considered myself a designer. I foolishly created listings on the Board Game Geek database to share files for these 3 print and play games, a decision I regret. And despite many requests over the years, I can't get Board Game Geek to remove the pages, and frankly, they don't belong there. These weren't polished games, they were early prototypes. BGG functions a lot like a CV for a professional game designer. As of the spring of 2023, I currently have 8 published games to my name, and I'd rather that these precursors didn't muddy the picture. So there's a lesson for you first-time designers out there. Don't create a Board Game Geek page for your game unless it's on the cusp of being published. You might regret it later. I enjoyed creating these 3 games so much I wanted to do more. Now, I'm not really a big sports fan, but I was still fearful of creating a wholly new rule set from scratch. So I went looking for another pre-existing set of rules to adapt. My next design project was recreating my favourite video game, Super Bomberman, as a board game. I went all in on this one. I spent weeks laying out the artwork, creating variable arenas, buying wooden components and recreating every aspect of the original game, with vague daydreams of publication, and in the knowledge that I would never be able to get the license to the video game characters, I devised my own narrative, a Hunger Games or Running Man styled arena full of wacky combatants. I called the game Elimination. If you ask a group of designers about using artwork in early prototypes, they will tell you to avoid beautifying your game because you'll be adapting, destroying and recreating it often, and wasted hours spent laying out graphics, not to mention the cost of ink, will make you reluctant to carry out necessary changes. Now, I must admit, I differ from most on this point. Laying out the artwork for a prototype is one of the most enjoyable parts. I get lost in it. Hours pass by in the blink of an eye. The process of laying out artwork, even as a placeholder, helps me to fall in love with the game. And frequently, time spent in this focused, creative mode helps me identify answers to mechanical issues. As if from nowhere, a solution will pop into my brain, addressing an issue identified in a recent playtest. I cherish these hours laying out graphics and imagining what the game could become. If you're designing for pleasure and simply want to create a wonderful game to play with friends or family with no aspirations to publication or commercial success, I fully support designers going all in on their project. Immerse yourself as deeply as you like. Create beautiful prototypes. I was fortunate that around the time I really started to indulge my new passion for design, a regular designer meetup was advertised by Rob Fisher, a local game inventor who had self-published his first game a couple of years earlier. I attended the inaugural meeting for the Cardiff Playtest Group back in 2014, and my professional game design journey began. Surrounding yourself with other game designers is inspiring, informing, challenging, sometimes frustrating, and always motivating. The knowledge that the group would be meeting every month, or in our case every week, gave me a drive to create. That soft deadline meant that I had to prototype quickly. New ideas and iterations were rapidly implemented. And perhaps most significantly, I learnt the value of playtesting. Perhaps the single biggest shift between the amateur designer and the professional is the commitment to numerous, rigorous, repetitive, sometimes tedious playtests. But that's the topic for another video, so follow the link above. Not quite ready to work without a safety net, my early designs in the group tended to be mashups of other games. What happens if I combine these 2 seemingly incompatible mechanisms? How would this game look if I rethemed it totally and let the theme inform the new mechanisms? Before long, I had a handful of promising prototypes which genuinely stood a chance. My knowledge of the industry was growing, and the autumn of that year I visited the Essen Spiel convention and started pitching for the first time. This video has turned into a potted history of my own early experiences as a game designer, and I'm not sure it could be any other way. This part of the process is so personal. I can't speak for others, but hopefully there are lessons here which help you with your own journey. There are some pieces of advice which are so frequently cited by game designers in playtest groups and online forums and stated with such certainty that I think they warrant revisiting and critiquing. Number 1. Prototype early, sometimes phrased as fail faster. The frequent advice to prototype early is sound. Get your ideas out of your head and onto the table before they become corrupted, cross-contaminated and weird. A physical prototype is a constraint. It reins you in and contains your ideas, grounding them in reality. A new game designer once told me that he had no need of playtesters. He could run simulations of all of the various game states and scenarios in his head, like that girl from the Queen's Gambit. This is nonsense. You're not ChatGPT. Get it on the table. Don't waste time and money on graphic design and art. Well, the frequent advice to keep your prototypes cheap and ugly is also sound, if you're aiming to streamline the process and reduce costs. But if you find joy and inspiration immersing yourself totally in a design project, and you're willing to accept the extra time and money this approach costs, then I say go for it. Number 3, don't base your game on popular properties from film or TV. Well, this advice is essential if you're hoping to publish your game. Most publishers don't want to invest in licensing rights, and your Ted Lasso football game is going to scare them off. But in the early stages of experimenting with design, I think this advice is limiting. Rip off anything and anybody, I say, just as long as you're not planning to sell anything. You're educating yourself, and fully realised worlds from popular intellectual properties might give you the inspiration you need. Number 4, play many games. Absolutely. This is going to inspire you. Many of the problems you hit when designing your own games will have been encountered by designers before you and overcome. There's no need for you to repeat those struggles. Play loads of games and fill your designer toolbox with mechanisms which have been proven to work in the past. Don't let budget stand in your way here. If you're designing for publication, you need to be up to date playing the latest games. But most games will have regular gaming meetups where you can play a variety of games without having to spend a penny. If you're designing for pleasure, well then it doesn't matter how up to date you are. Pick up any old game from the back of your closet or from the dusty shelves of a charity shop. But you must play regularly to stay inspired, to keep those creative cogs turning. Number 5, playtest extensively. Well, this is crucial for a professional designer. It's optional for an amateur. You can playtest as much or as little as you like. Lots of playtests are going to teach you a ton about design, but if the lack of a playtest group is a barrier preventing you from realising your vision, make it anyway. Creating a broken, unbalanced game is still an achievement, and I'd rather it existed in physical form than in your frontal lobe. Just don't try and sell it to me. Number 6, a successful game sells XXXX copies. Well, this is short-sighted. You define success as you see fit. When I was a kid, success meant facilitating an enjoyable afternoon flicking cards around the coffee table with my mates. A decade ago, success meant faithfully recreating every aspect of my favourite video game. These days, I stress out over sales figures, royalty checks and positive reviews, and I wish I didn't. Always remember the reason you got into game design and try not to lose the sense of childlike wonder. Creating your first board game can seem like a daunting task, but with determination and a playful spirit, you can turn that squatter in your frontal cortex into a tangible, playable game. Whether you start small with a simple concept or dive headfirst into a complex immersive world, the key is to keep iterating and honing your game until it's ready for the world. This has been a refreshing video to make. Most of the videos on my channel are focused on designing for commercial success, and that's a wholly different skill to what I've covered here. If you're interested in professionally publishing your games, I strongly encourage you to use a design thinking approach, identifying a market, understanding it, recognising the player's needs, ideating solutions and then prototyping and testing rigorously. To learn more about this approach, follow the link.